So whatever you were cultivating on the weekend, you might have been cultivating joy or potatoes or reality TV or parenting or something. How do you leave that in the weekend? And of course you can't abandon it because it's had an impact on you. And then sensing further back in time, what's the residual impact of the head circle lessons from last week? And when you reflect back on last week, there might be several kinds of memories. So you might have visual memories, what you were seeing. You might have emotional memories, like what you were feeling. You might have more bodily memories, so the sort of somatic memories about what your body was feeling. You might have more auditory memories, like what was said, what you heard. And then, of course, you might remember tastes, of the best coffee that you had last week. I'm doing a random survey. Red Cup currently beats Chit Chat for coffee. But the choices are fairly limited around here. Where's that? Oh. Oh, okay. Okay, gotcha. Thank you, Jane. Good. So all of these things evoke different kinds of memory. And our brain obviously takes in stimuli from any of those different senses, and then it encodes it as a memory that is more readily experienced as the memory in that sensory modality. So we have those kinds of different memories. So people talk about muscle memory. It's not that the memory is in the muscle, but the memory it resides when the muscle is activated in a certain way. The brain recognizes it, just like it recognizes hearing a tune and goes, oh yeah, I know that, I recognize that. In the same way that it will recognize the sensation of a muscle contracting and the path of the movement and that sort of stuff. So it's not like the memory of a song resides in the song. It resides in the recognition of that, in the way that the brain encodes that memory. So we have all of these different kinds of memories. And last week we talked about Feldenkrais training our attention. So attention is the precursor to memory. If you don't attend to something, you don't notice it, therefore you can't remember it. You can't put it into memory because you haven't noticed it in the first place. So we're training attention, and then actually by paying attention to certain modes of stimulus, so particularly somatic body, you are then putting it into memory because I keep asking you to refer to it. So this is also a memory training exercise, if you like. And comparing the similarities and comparing the differences in memory traces from what you've felt or heard or smelt or seen previously to this state. So if you feel tired, cognitively tired after a day at the training, there's a reason, because your brain chews up a fair bit of energy. And this attention and this using your memory, and then of course the next part of the cognitive sort of cycle is problem solving. You're doing all the time. You're working your brains really hard lying on the floor here. So if your family and friends still think that you're coming here to cop out, snigger at them. So with all of that, that's a little bit of a preamble into the week. Slowly roll over and come up to standing. Now, standing is such a familiar position. It's so habitual. You've been doing it since before you were one, because you would have pulled yourself up to standing anywhere from 6, 7, 8 months onwards. And hanging on in a wobbly fashion to mum's or dad's little finger, or on cruising around on the furniture. But this sort of idea of what's all this trouser business going on? It's cold. It's got chilly. There's trousers going on. There's jackets coming off. It's like, oh my Lord. Okay. So standing is not just a social thing now, it's a mobility thing. Like, you all look ready for action in a way that lying down you look very, very different. So when you're teaching, you need to be prepared for that. Just like I said, exactly this time last week, when you ask someone to come up to sitting in an ATM, be aware that they will change immediately. Their relationship to you and the environment will change, as opposed to lying down and then sitting. And if you don't know that, just go down and lie down again, slowly come up. And maybe you can't, but catch the shift in attention. And when does it change? It might change pre-movement. It might not. But see if you can catch a shift in your relationship to the environment. It's on a bit of a sliding scale as well. And just maybe, this is a bizarre conceit, but maybe somewhere in there's this evolutionary reason why we did this in the first place. Why did we do this in the first place? Why did we get up off the ground and become erect like this? Because it came at a great cost to our biomechanics to do this. So if you have any kind of glimpse about what this affords you, what this position affords you, what it offers you, literally what vistas does it open out to you? Yeah. So it's not just about seeing, it's about your hands being free, and it's about the 360-ness, maybe. You've got a vertical axis now. So we explored the vertical axis last week in sitting, but now you've got a vertical axis in standing, a very small base of support. So takes very little energy for you to turn around yourself now, because you're a stick, as opposed to whatever you were on the floor, a camera tripod or something. Okay, so now come back to standing quietly and just have your weight on 2 feet. And if you feel comfortable balancing with your eyes shut in standing, please do. Yeah, and it makes a difference whether you're on your mat or not on your mat, but just as long as you know that it's on your mat, you'll just have slightly less input from the floor. Now, if you don't feel comfortable with your eyes closed standing, and this would be true for many members of the public, then you can have a chair nearby you or stand near the wall or something like that. Or keep your eyes open, but just lower your gaze so that you're not grabbing things with your eyes. And begin to get a sense of where all of your bits are in space. And now you don't have the mirror of the floor. So do you get a sense of the shape of your spine? Because the effort is different in standing now to lying, isn't it? So you're getting different information from your spine because different muscles are working. Do you get a sense of where your shoulder joints are? That's a yes or no question. And then your shoulder joints in relation to your hip joints. And because you're seasoned troopers scanning yourself on the floor, you've got that to compare to. So in a way, your brain can remember, well, I know where my shoulders are and my hip joints are when I'm lying on the floor because I feel blah, 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 blah. What do you access? What senses do you access to know where your hips are and your shoulders are? And is your right shoulder somewhat over your right hip and your left shoulder somewhat over your left hip? Equally. Now, because this posture is so habitual, it's actually really hard to tell. Because we think that what we normally sense, we have this bizarre delusion that what we sense is sort of straight and symmetrical, and it's not necessarily. Do you get a sense of if you track from your hip joints down to your feet, the length of your right leg and the length of your left leg? And then getting a sense of how much weight your right leg is taking and how much weight your left leg is taking. Does it feel equal? And how does the weight transmit from the floor up through you? Do you have a sense of how your shoulders are hanging? So maybe there's part of your hand that's touching your thigh. Maybe not. Maybe one is and one isn't. And I'm saying all these things quite deliberately because, and we'll go through them again, because this is what you're going to look at when you look at each other in standing. So what would somebody else see if they were looking at you in terms of your arm hanging, your leg length, where your weight is, your shoulders relative to your hips and your spine, the shape of your spine, where your face is pointing? Now very slowly, and if you need to open your eyes now, that is absolutely fine, because probably for 50% at least, standing on one leg with your eyes open is a dream, not a reality. Now, it will change, because this is highly trainable. Quietly shift your weight so that you come onto one leg only. But take your time. And notice which leg you went to first. And you could ask yourself, why? Why did I go to that leg first? So remember which leg it was. Chances are this is nominally your preferred standing leg. Maybe not. You might be perverse and you knew your standing leg was your right leg and you made yourself go to the left or something. So, it's not an absolute, but chances are that the spontaneous one was your standing leg. Now, it might have not been your standing leg for all time, and we'll talk about this. Now go ahead and try it on the other leg and see, is there something about moving your weight onto the other leg that tells you, confirms to you why you went to the first leg first? And what's the qualitative difference between standing on one leg and the other? Maybe there's very subtle difference. Maybe it's a dramatic difference. Depends on your history and your injuries and where you start from. When I say the qualitative difference, I mean, so how quiet can you be on one leg versus how quiet you could be on the other leg? And how do you stack up over one leg versus the other? What happens to your balance? Good. And find a way to rest in standing. Not a joke. It's a reality. How would you rest? Yep, you distribute weight. Actually, some of you would go really slack and slide onto one leg and drop into your hip and do all sorts of funny things. But that might not be a rest. It might just be a habit. Okay. And now move your weight to your right leg and have your left leg sort of pushed out a little bit more to the side. So it's straight and it's just the big toe of your left foot on the floor. So find a distance that's comfortable and sustainable because you're going to stay here. So it's a bit like an outrigger. I always think about it, like a flying buttress on a cathedral. It's sort of there to support you. It's not too far and not too close. And so, again, sense that your weight is mostly on your right leg. Now, generally speaking, it's easier. You may feel safer with your eyes open. I'll leave it up to you, but it's perfectly fine to have your eyes open. And if you with your eyes open, my one caveat is to, just like you're going to keep your breathing soft and uninterrupted and unimpressed by the movements, I ask you to keep your gaze equally soft and equally unimpressed by the movements so that it's not grabbing at anything and getting fixed and frowning and all that sort of stuff. So just play around with that a little bit, but feel perfectly free to have your eyes open. Soft gaze. And now slowly tilt yourself to the right so that the direction of the movement is that as you're tilting, your right hand goes a little bit closer to the floor. That's the idea of the tilt. As if you were going to drop your right hand a little bit to the floor and keep then coming back up to the sort of starting position, which is on your right leg. And notice when, as you're tilting, does the left foot get a little bit lighter off the floor? So your arm drops a little bit, your head goes to the left, your whole trunk goes enough to the right. Eventually, if the tilt gets big enough, it's like the right foot is picked up not by the leg lifting, but by the body tilting. So can you get to that point where, sorry, the left leg. Oh, Linda, I'm so happy that you picked me up on that. So that's the tilt of the shoulders and the whole trunk going to the right that lifts up the left leg. There, that's it. Feel that kind of teapot. I'm a little teapot. And if you don't want to lift that toe all the way off, that's fine, but feel that sense that it's not work in the left hip joint lifting the leg off. It's the tilt of the whole body over the right leg that lifts the leg. And just play around in that point, that part where it lifts and lowers and lifts and lowers. Good. Come back onto 2 feet. And maybe in this position, having a rest is having a little walk, just to relieve any kind of weirdo things happening in the small of your back or... Good. And then come back to your spot. And again, have your left leg a little bit out to the side, resting on the left big toe so that your weight is shifted onto the right. And again, begin this idea of tilting to the right. And all of you have done it, but just FYI, if you're teaching this, some people start to turn when they do this. So you might just making sure it's kind of a non-negotiable that people stay in this same plane. So it's actually the plane of the front wall. So it's the coronal plane, the heart plane, in this kind of tipping action. So get a sense that that's what's happening. That's it. And again, find that point where you can feel that connection between the dropping of the shoulders and the trunk to the right, that the left leg just has to lift off by virtue of being connected, but not by any virtue of activity in the left hip itself, in the leg itself. It's just dangling. So like your right arm is dangling, your left leg is dangling. Where is that point? Now, to make it really clear, next time you go to the right just a little bit, consciously lift the left leg away from the floor. So it's not the tipping, it's actually the movement in the hip joint. So it's like the sort of more, that's it. So really clarify that that's not it, that's work in the side of your left hip joint. That you can lift the leg up with its own volition, and then come back to that idea of the left leg being quite passive. It's just being tipped, but tipped upwards. That's it. And for most people, actually, you can feel the effort in the hip joint. So it actually feels like you don't want to do it. Now, if you're a dancer, you're used to doing it, and that effort in your hip joint is kind of familiar. So for some people, it's that's the habit, is to lift it away. So however it is for you, get that sense of the left hip joint staying quiet in order for the leg to be picked up, not to pick itself up. I think I've laboured that point enough. And then can you get a sense that the more stable the right leg is, the easier it is for the left leg to be free? So there's this relationship. In order for the left leg to become free of the floor, the right leg has to find a greater level of stability. So it's not necessary, it's not about, strengthening the left leg to lift or anything like that. It's actually about finding the stability in the right leg in order for the left leg to be free. There's a beautiful kind of interdependence between the two legs here. So get a sense of how you play with that. So as the weight comes off of the left foot, the responsibility for the weight bearing becomes 100% on the right. And as soon as the right toe comes down, of course, it starts to share responsibility. And then slowly come back, left toe, thank you. Come back to taking equal weight on both feet. Now, again, this is a one-sided lesson, so you might feel tempted to try and do all of that on the left leg. Resist the temptation. Oh, resist these evil temptations to even yourself up. So that you notice more and more, we're kind of really, really, really going into this idea of having a standing leg and what Larry calls a gesturing leg. The reason I'm sort of quoting Larry a lot is because these lessons come from the Strasbourg training that he and Elizabeth Berenger ran God knows how many years ago. So it's peppered with his and Elizabeth's language. And he calls the standing leg and the gesturing leg. Okay. Maybe lie down a bit. Just a bit. Only lie down a bit. Just a bit of you lie down. You can choose which bit lies down. I don't know what I meant by lying down. Maybe a bit in time is what I meant. So what's the influence of standing more on the right leg and allowing the left leg to become free? So for some people, their right leg is their favourite standing leg. So this is kind of going with their pattern. It's reinforcing what their system already thinks, feels, does. For other people, if the left leg is your standing leg, this is quite alien. And it might be a bit discombobulating. So there's a bit of sorting that might be happening in your brain at the moment because you're going against your pattern. So if you have an idea of what your habitual standing leg is, then you can reference your experiences on the floor to that. And remember, chances are that the leg that you spontaneously stood on earlier is your standing leg, but maybe not. The one that you naturally put more weight on. So when you're standing on two legs, which leg would you naturally favour? And we can talk more about this idea of a standing leg. It's a bit of a Feldenkrais conceit. I mean, it is a case. Like we have a dominant hand for dexterity, and the other hand is good for holding and stability. So if you think about using a mixing bowl, you've got one hand that's really good at holding the bowl still, and one hand that's really good at stirring. You've got one hand that's really good at holding the paper still, and the other hand's really good at writing. So that's the analogy of you've got a hand that's really good at stabilizing and a hand that's really good at being mobile. So and we kind of erroneously call the dexterous hand the dominant hand because we give primacy to dexterity, but really, if you think about cooking, and I work with a lot of people who are one-handed, if you don't have a holding hand, life's really hard. You need all these special things in the kitchen to hold the bowl still and the paper still, and all that. Try it at home. Try being one-handed, and you'll realize how important the so-called non-dominant hand is. So in the leg, there is a leg that is probably better organized to be stable, to be the standing leg, and there's a leg that is maybe better organized, in Larry's words, to be the gesturing leg, or you could say the stepping leg or the kicking leg or the doing leg. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so for some people, the standing leg fits in with the holding hand, but not always. It's not as correlated as you'd think, because it's not such a strongly wired in thing neurologically. Like we have the so-called dominant hemisphere on the left hemisphere, which controls the right hand for most people. That's why most of us are right-handed. That this sort of dominance for the leg is not so clearly wired up in terms of which hemisphere, and it's very, very susceptible to injury and pain. And that's why, so when you start looking at each other, you'll see kind of ghosts of the standing leg changing from one leg to the other. But you can have a little look at each other and experiment about that. Okay, so come up to standing. And notice today that the ATM, I'm giving you a lot of kind of theoretical information in the breaks because that's setting the scene for the week, right? So I'm kind of getting your attention while you're a little bit susceptible, while I've got your attention, and so that you're linking the theory with the experience. That's the potential. So it's a judicious choice. I'm doing it on purpose, not just because I'm I'm de-introverting myself. Oh dear, like that. Okay, good. And now again, shift your weight onto your right leg and have your left big toe on the floor. And find again that point where you can tip so that your whole right self tips over the right leg so that your right hand, goes closer to the floor. And you're staying in that plane, and you find that little point where the left big toe can become very light on the floor. Good. And then next time your big toe comes back down to the floor, and you prepare yourself to go to the right again, can you go to the right but have your weight more on your heel? So for some people, it already was there, and you're going, well, big deal. Yes, that's where I live. I live on my heels. For other people, that is quite hard because you don't. Your weight isn't. So this is by asking yourself that, by following the instruction, actually, from Jenny's point of view, that I instructed you to move your weight to the heel. It gave you the opportunity to ask yourself the question is, oh, is that where I was to start with? Or how do I get there? I don't know that part of me. So eventually you can use an instruction to ask yourself questions, but that's what we're actually learning here, is how do you start asking yourself better questions in response to an instruction? Yeah, they do that. Yeah. Yep. And we'll explore that a little bit later, but this is really keeping it quite a pure side tilt. So moving your weight more to the heel, does it make it easier to tip or harder to tip? That's another question you could ask yourself. And then you could explore, well, where should, could, does the weight go that makes it easier to tilt, and experiment, explore a bit more. So I've given you one option, that your weight goes more to the heel. Maybe the weight could go more towards the toes. Good. Rest a bit in standing. Just rest. And again, if you're teaching this class to a group of folk, so some people who've got a lot of pain on their right side won't want to keep doing this on their right side. Encourage them, then they can do it on their left side, but they have to stay with that side, because it's the sidedness that's going to give you information. Yep. So, there's a sort of that's a tactic in this lesson, is to keep doing it one-sided so that the difference becomes more and more obvious. Yep. Okay, good. Bring your weight back onto your right leg and have your left big toe propped out. And now as you tip to the right, can you lift your left arm and your left leg actively in the direction of the ceiling, and then let them drop a few times? So find that point where you can balance and you can lift, and lift them the same amount. And let them drop at the same time. So they lift together. The arm lifts away from you. The left arm lifts away from you with the left leg lifting away from the middle. So they both go in the direction of the ceiling, only as much as each other. But they do lift. So it's not just the tip now. They actually lift. Starts from hanging. Yeah. This is actually really showing me that some of you were lifting your left arm anyway to balance. Actively lifting it and then letting it drop. And actively lifting it and actively letting it go, i.e. passive. Actively active means passive in this instance. You've tilted a little bit, so you've got your weights on your right. You have to have shifted your weight onto your right leg because you're lifting your left leg and your left arm. but you're not necessarily using the tilt to do that lift as much. You're actually lifting the arm and the leg in themselves and letting them drop. Yep. See how much more social you are when you're standing? You're asking questions. You're extroverted whether you want to be or not. Tiny bit. So there's this active lifting of the left arm and the left leg, and then letting them drop. So there's a drop. That's it. Plop. So the left toe would come back to the floor, wouldn't it? If it was just dropping to where you started, to the starting position. That's it. Okay, good. And then go back to that initial test movement, which is to tip to the right and allow your left leg to be lifted. And then notice what happens if I remind you that the left arm can dangle as well. So it's simply a tilt in the right hip joint. The left arm can dangle. The right arm's already dangling. We haven't done anything with the right arm. The left arm is not lifting anymore because we've consciously done that. That's it. Go for a little walk, have a bit of a rest in walking. Not often that you hear that phrase, is it? Have a rest in walking. What does that mean? What do you kind of shake loose? Some effort in the small of your back, some effort in your head, some feeling in your hip joints, your toes, were they gripping? What is it that needs a rest? Okay, come back to your spot. And shift your weight onto your right leg so that your left big toe is out to the side. And bring your right arm over the top of your head so that your right hand can hold your left ear. And now begin to tip and find that point where your left leg is lifted. And again, notice if this instigates a twist or not, and have the intention that the movement is staying in the plane of the front wall. And notice that the plane of the face stays towards the front or not. What's your tendency? Do you want to look around more to the right, or wanting to look up to the ceiling? And if it's not clear, maybe exaggerate it so that as you tip, your right elbow goes more towards the back of the room. So where does your nose go? Or that your elbow goes towards the front of the room, in which case your nose goes somewhere else. So explore around this idea of not twisting by twisting. Again, this is a classic Feldenkrais kind of strategy, is when we're after something, a fairly pure movement, we explore what the pure movement isn't in order to get the movement more pure, as it were. And if the aim was to find a way to simply stand on the right leg and be very balanced and not to stay in the same plane, for you, would with a twist forwards or a twist backwards, so the nose more towards the floor or more towards the ceiling? What would help you if I wasn't putting this constraint on? Would you gaze to the ground or would you gaze to the ceiling? Good. Go for a little walk. Rest in walking. And again, notice what needs this rest in walking. Maybe it's the knee joint. Maybe you're, holding your knee joint really tight. Something in the toes, the other, so you're using your left buttock, which is the whole point of this lesson, is to let it go. Yeah. Yep, so if your left glutes are working, it's because you're lifting your left leg with your glutes, as opposed to letting your left leg dangle, which is absolutely fine. There's a bit of an obsession in gyms about switching glutes on, which is kind of fine, but you need to know how to switch them off as well. Otherwise, you're a tight ass. It's a biomechanical term. Good. Okay, come back onto your right leg. Come back to your spot and to your right leg with your left toe. Hey? Oh, your flabby ass. Yeah. You can, look, it's the whole thing about Feldenkrais then is you've got an option, haven't you? You can let it all hang out, or you can tighten. You have buns of steel. You can have both. Oh, and everything in between. So move your weight onto your right leg again and your left big toes out to the side. And find that tipping point where the left toe is on, off, and find the stability there. And now in that position again, this time, bring your right hip joint a little bit forwards and a little bit backwards. So your right hip joint goes more over your toes and then it goes more towards your heel. And this is going to be a tiny movement, right? So you're pushing the right hip joint a little bit forward and a little bit back at that teapot tipping point. The hip going forwards and backwards at the same time, alternating. Yeah. At the same, so you're tipping and you stay at that tipping point, and at that point of being tipped, wherever you feel. So for some people, they're doing it with their toe off, which is absolutely fine. And some people, they're just keeping like the toenail on the floor. So it's up to you where you feel stable, that you can maybe, and try both, But the main thing is that you're not committing a lot of weight to your big toe, and you're not doing a lot of work in your left hip joint as well. That's it. And then and how do you find a way for your right hip joint to be free enough to move forward and back? And what does your head do? Is there a sort of a counterpoise movement in your head, or actually are you using your head? Is your head moving more than your hip, which is true for some people? So they think that their hip joint's in their head, which is a possibility, not a reality. So you might find that there could actually be a counterpoise of the head movement. So as the right hip joint comes forward, the head might go back a little bit to counterpoise. That would be, and if that's hard, that's a bit of a giveaway that you're using your head to initiate the forward. So does that make sense, that as your right hip goes forward, your head goes backward a little bit to counterpoise, counterbalance? And again, do it both ways. If you're not clear what you are doing, so if those of you who are moving their head further forward as their right hip came forward, chances are you're probably initiating with your head. Can you feel the difference? Don't answer. Quiet voice, internal. And so where are you taller? As your hip goes forward or as your hip goes back? Rest a moment. Rest in standing. Rest however you need. Not resting lying down though. Well, you can. Of course you can. But don't groan when you have to get up again. So come back onto your right leg. And have your left big toe out to the side. And shift you, so your weight is onto your right leg, and find that point where you feel that you can stay there. And at that point, so that you've taken a bit of weight off your big toe, so it's not, so you have made some attempt to tilt. That's it. So you are tilted in a way that's sustainable. And now move your right hip a little bit more to the right and a little bit more to the left. What the hell? How do I do that? And what does your head do? Does it counterpoise? Does it go with it? How do you find a way to get a little bit of mobility in your hip joint left and right and still maintain the tilt? Does it help to counterpoise? So that as the hip goes to the right, the head goes to the left a little bit. And as the hip goes to the left a little bit, which is in a way is going more towards the middle, the head goes to the right. How do you find that? And what's happening in the ankle joint? Well, actually more precisely in the whole of the foot, throughout the length of the foot, to allow the hip joint to move a little bit right and left. Does something change in the contact of the foot on the floor, or the angle of the way the shin goes into the foot? So funny, I just found myself really leaning to the left because I'm going with you. That's called resonance. But I'm doing it as a mirror resonance because I'm going to the left and you're going to the right. But there you go. Okay. You could say that's one of my colleagues who's in dance calls that empathy. I always think of empathy as an emotional thing, but he thinks of it as a physical thing as well. Okay, so come back to the middle. Obviously, you already have because you're getting a bit tired of good. Lie down. Lie on your back. Lie on your back with a great deal of abandon. Give it up. So when we say give it up, which is quite a common thing, it's a bit of a feldy babble thing, what are you giving up? So where is the work? That when you lie on the floor, catch yourself in that moment. Which bit of you is going, like giving it up, giving up the work? So important to catch that moment because that tells you where you were efforting a lot. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that you can pay a little bit more attention to when you're standing. Take a little more care of because it's the workhorse. Could also be the whingy part of you. And what's the influence of this incredibly asymmetrical set of instructions and the way that you sense your right leg and the left leg? And roll up to sitting and standing. And return to that position. And again, so your weight is on the right leg. You tip to you're on your left big toe. You tip to the right. Find that point where you're tipping, and there is a clear lift reduction of any weight going through the left toe. You know, whether you keep your sock touching is up to you. And again, begin this movement of the the right hip going more to the right, and then coming back to the tipping position, and then moving to the left. That's it. And that your head can counterpoise. So as your right hip goes more to the right, your head goes more to the left in space, just a bit. It's a counterpoising movement. And then as the right hip goes more to the left, then the head drops a little bit more to the right. It's a shift to the right. So the hip joint isn't turning in a rotation plane, it's ABAD ducting. That's it. That's it. Sorry, I wasn't looking at you before to see what you're doing before, but and then your head's free to move. That's it. So in which of those do you feel taller? As your hip goes more to the right, you kind of, or as your hip comes more over your leg, over the right foot. So for most people, as the hip joint goes more to the right, you feel more weight on the outside of your foot. And then as your hip joint comes to the middle of the foot and then more to the inside of the foot. So sense that shift of weight from left to right on the foot that maybe correlates with the shift of the hip joint itself. Not easy, huh? That's really pacing you to find this really difficult. Oh my God, this is so hard. It's a terrible thing. You wouldn't say that in an ATM. It's precise. So for some of you, precision in an ATM is really interesting, and for some it's really frustrating. So if you're holding your breath, you don't have to, because it's just a little exploration. That's it. And walk again. And maybe you can see this next one coming. Come back to your spot. What do we do when we've explored left and right and forwards and backwards? We do a circle. So come back to your spot, stand on your right leg, left toe out to the side, begin the tipping action so that you are really committed over your right leg, and begin to make a circle with your right hip joint. And where does your head go? To counterpoise. So again, if the circle is not clear, you can go back to the forwards, backwards, left and right. So using all of your strategies around how do you build a forwards, backwards, left, right exploration into a circle, feel free to do that. Feel free to explore 1/4 of the circle or a half of the circle. If you've really committed your head to tilt more than your trunk, then there's probably, you might lose a bit in your neck. So have a sense that your head and your trunk are still in a fairly reasonable and congruent line. What that might mean is that there's not so much of a shortening between one shoulder and the hip on one side compared to the other. And which direction of the circle did you go in? And then do the opposite direction if you haven't already. Good, have a little walk. I needed to get off my left. I'm so far on my left buttock, it's not funny. I just need to. So if I'm feeling one-sided, you must be feeling quite one-sided. Good. Good, come back to the spot, your spot. And stand on your right leg with your left toe out. And come back to this idea of simply tipping. And can you get a sense that as you tip, the shape of your spine doesn't change in this plane? So from the back of your head all the way down to your coccyx, the whole spine is tipping. So there's no kind of shortening between the ribs and the pelvis, or lengthening, shortening on one side and lengthening on the other. That's it. What's that like? So that original relationship of your right shoulder to your right hip and the left shoulder to the left hip, in a way, doesn't change. How does that work? That's it. And now with that in mind, so that the trunk tips over the right hip joint and everything stays roughly the same, begin to make that circle with your hip. So you tipped to the right with this idea of your trunk being one piece, and that if your spine stays roughly the same, then this isn't a pelvic circle, a pelvic clock, which is movement in your lumbar spine. Your lumbar spine's not going to move. It's like your spine is a stick, and therefore as you make the circle in the hip joint, your head will be carried. How? It'll counterpoise, and you'll breathe, because I'm not breathing. I just realized, because I'm working so hard for you on your behalf. And if that doesn't make sense, go back to just the forwards and backwards with this idea of the spine not participating. And if the spine stays the same shape and the and the right hip goes forwards and backwards, where does the head have to go? It gets carried backwards and forwards, so it counterpoises, and then go to the right and the left with the same idea. That's it. So it's quite a refinement, isn't it, to have the spine disappear and just move the whole of the whole of your trunk over that right hip joint. It makes the circle a little bit smaller. Breathing. Good. Rest and walk. Actually, just lie down on your mat. Just lie down on your mat. We're into justice here. It's all just. Notice what that means from the length of your spine's point of view, an idea that you might have in your internal image of yourself of the right hip versus the left hip, the right shoulder versus the left shoulder, and the length between those two. So the length between the right shoulder and the right hip, and the length between the left shoulder and the left hip. The length of the right leg, so from the right hip down to the right heel, and from the left hip down to the left heel. Slowly come up to standing. And strike your pose. Now, just a couple of times, enough to be satisfied, go to that original movement. So you're on your right leg, and you want to quietly de-weight your left toe by tipping, keeping the line of you. So your right arm goes more towards the floor. And how is that now? This feeling that you can simply tilt the whole of your trunk to the right, and the line down the front of you stays roughly the same. So, and the distance between your right shoulder and your right hip and the left shoulder and the left hip stays approximately the same. And find that point where you can balance. This kind of teapot. I'm a little tea. That's it. I won't sing because that would be very good. Come back onto both feet, and now shift your weight a little bit onto the right leg and the left leg, so you can just in your normal standing position. So the very first thing that you did in terms of movement this morning, go to stand on one leg and then the other. And what's the availability like? Do you like being on one leg more than the other? Has that changed? Where would you live? On which leg? If you had to choose a leg to live on, you don't. It's like choosing your favourite child. You don't have to, but let's just say. Is it different to this morning? So again, for some people, if your right leg was the one that you went on to the most confidently this morning, this might just be really serving to confirm that pattern. If you went more confidently onto your left leg, then this has disrupted your pattern. And it might be a pleasant disruption, it might be a really shitty disruption. Or your corpus callosum could be working overtime and you can stand on both legs better. Maybe not, who knows. Go for a walk. Notice how you shift your weight as you're walking. So start off small. What movements do you do to shift the weight onto the advancing leg? Are there any echoes of... So some people do tilt onto their weight-bearing leg. Some people just drop onto it. And then find a way that your walking could take you to whichever physiological need is uppermost. Cup of tea or toilet. So is it thirst or is it voiding that's going to be the primary driver? Or can you withstand all physiological drives and just simply walk for the sheer pleasure of it?